It's Cinemassacre's Monster Madness.
Cinemassacre.
To close out this year's Monster Madness, I'd say I left the best for last. We've had mummies, Frankenstein, giant monsters, aliens. It's only fitting that we end with zombies. And there's no zombie series more important than director George Romero's Dead series. You know the gist. It's set in a dystopian, end-of-the-world type environment. The dead rise to eat the flesh of the living. They can only be killed by having their brains destroyed with a bullet or other object. The living people struggle for survival and fight amongst themselves. That's the formula that all zombie movies followed since. Of course, in the past decade, there's been so many zombie movies, it's mind-numbing. Recently, The Walking Dead show brought it to the mainstream with television audiences. Zombies have probably never been more popular than they are now, but they still seem to take their inspiration from the George Romero films. We all know the first one, but if you didn't, it was Night of the Living Dead in 1968, the only black and white film of the franchise. I talked about it during the first year's Monster Madness, and in my top 30 favorite films list, and in my trip to the Night of the Living Dead cemetery video, so I think I've already said enough about it. But you know what? This is Sequel-a-thon, so I can't skip over the movie that single-handedly changed the face of the whole horror movie industry, so I'm going to save it for Halloween. Maybe a little unconventional that we're going out of order, but I have something special planned for it. Anyway, Dawn of the Dead I also mentioned the first year, but let's dig deeper. It was released in 1978, 10 years after the original. One thing that has to be said about the Dead series is that even though they're considered to be sequels, they typically don't have any recurring characters. But each movie seems to have a progression that the zombie apocalypse is growing and the human population is becoming less and less. People often complain about characters in horror movies doing things that are stupid, but these characters are smart, and that makes us respect them. As the movie goes on, we come to know them like old friends, and we root for their survival. Dawn of the Dead is the dawn, the light at the end of the tunnel. It's a more optimistic look at people. Through hard work and teamwork, we can all settle our differences. The mall setting gives a great opportunity for lots of comedy, but it's also noted that it's social satire as well, comparing mall shoppers to zombies. Overall, Dawn of the Dead is simply a masterpiece sequel. It's one of those rare Bride of Frankenstein or Aliens type situations where the sequel is debatably better than the first one. Following in the footsteps of a groundbreaking horror masterpiece, this one manages to be groundbreaking all over again in its own right. There's different cuts to this movie. There's the US version, the European version, and the extended version, which runs a little bit too long. Between the US and European versions, they both have their advantages. It's hard to pick one. Dario Argento handled the European version and had his disagreements with George Romero. I think if I had to choose one, I'd pick the US version just because it has some great moments that were missing from the European version. Either way, you're in for a great film. I can't do it justice, so don't listen to me, just watch it for yourself. Day of the Dead was the black sheep sequel of the franchise. It had two masterpieces to compare with, and it came out in 1985, the same year as Return of the Living Dead, Fright Night, and Reanimator. So it had a lot to live up to. George Romero's original script was so large and epic that Tom Savini described it as the Ben-Hur of zombie movies. Unfortunately, there were budget cuts, and the finished film wasn't as huge a scale as Romero intended. When it came out, fans and critics hated it, but over the years since, it's been re-evaluated, and people are starting to realize it overcame the number 3 curse. It's another masterpiece like the first two. So how did its excellence go unnoticed for so long? Same happened with me. The first time I saw it, I didn't like it. I thought that it paled in comparison to the first two movies. It didn't have a memorable soundtrack. It didn't have a fun mall setting. Not as many funny one-liners. But over the years, after rewatching it, it's grown on me like a fungus. The first two Dead movies brushed upon this theme, but now we're going under the surface, and while we are quite literally going underground, we are getting at the core of what these movies are really about, the dehumanization of people and the rise of the dead. I think if it were to go full circle, we might have Planet of the Zombies, kind of like Planet of the Apes, where apes are the intelligent life form and people are the animals. When I first saw the movie and didn't like it, I was still impressed by the gore. This has to be Tom Savini's crowning achievement. It's a true testament to the power of practical special effects. It's darker than the other movies, and being underground the whole time, it feels a lot more claustrophobic. We're stuck with a bunch of nutty characters, and it feels like we're in the madhouse with them. It would have been the perfect way to end the trilogy. It's probably the best horror trilogy since the Karloff trilogy of Frankenstein films. I know I equate this to Frankenstein all the time, but it's true. As far as quality goes, the third Dead movie is the equivalent of the third Frankenstein film. It's the one that at first seems inferior, but as time goes on, it grows on you. All three of them have their own advantages, so it's hard to pick a favorite, and each one represents the decade in which it was made. Night of the Living Dead was the 60s, Dawn of the Dead was the 70s, Day of the Dead was the 80s. I think 1985 was the peak year in zombie films. You had Return of the Living Dead and Reanimator and all that. I think after that year, zombie movies were done. Like, that's it. You can't beat it. It tied it all up in a nice, beautiful bow of blood-soaked intestines. Night of the Living Dead was remade in 1990 with Tom Savini in the director's chair. And by the 2000s, zombie movies were in full bloom again. There were more zombie movies in the 2000s than there were in every other decade total, including a remake of both Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead. Rumors of a fourth Dead film were floating around for a long time, but then it finally happened. The master himself, George Romero, made a much welcome return to the genre that he created. Since we went from night to dawn to day, everyone assumed this would be Dusk of the Dead or Twilight of the Dead, but we were all wrong. It was Land of the Dead. All the other zombie movies of the time stopped and bowed down to the true king. This wasn't just another zombie movie. This was the real thing. It was George Romero. All the other movies seemed like appetizers for the main course. But in the grand scheme of things, Land of the Dead unfortunately seemed to blend in with the rest. It's very much like the Edgar Allan Poe story, Mask of the Red Death, where the plague is killing everybody on the outside, while the prince throws a party inside his safe fortress for all his elite crowd. John Leguizamo and Dennis Hopper. I'm having some kind of deja vu moment here. You know what I'm thinking of. The Super Mario Brothers movie. So, I've mentioned its strengths and its weaknesses. Overall, Land of the Dead doesn't match its predecessors, but it's still pretty damn good. I was satisfied with it, I got my fix. But then, only 2 years later, he came out with another one, Diary of the Dead. I did not expect this. But hey, another one from the master, I'll take it. George Romero's always been one of my idols, but there comes a time when you realize not everything your idol does is gold. I like the idea of this found footage style, but here it's done completely wrong. The whole idea of that style is to make it seem convincing that what you're watching is real. Most importantly, there's the acting. In these found footage films, that's the hardest part to get right. If the acting is not believable, then everything falls apart. And here, all the acting, all across the board, is awful. Romero always has an agenda. Every movie he makes has some kind of message. One thing he seems to be getting at here is how people are becoming desensitized to the tragedies of the world. I can see how some people vicariously watch the tragedies on the news safe from their living rooms, but I don't understand how this applies to the filmmakers who are actually there in danger themselves. Another thing the movie seems to be trying to say is that the news on TV hides the truth. I would assume the message here is that the common people who record things and upload them to the internet are a more truthful source of information, but then the movie goes on to say that there's an oversaturation of information because everybody with a camera is uploading stuff. So what is the message? What is the movie really trying to say? It's the first Romero film where the politics and the messages get in the way of it being an entertaining movie. I respect that Romero went back to his indie roots. Diary of the Dead was much lower budget than Land of the Dead, and Romero said that he had a lot more control over it. I'm glad that he's still making movies in the 21st century, but this is one that I tend to forget about. It tried to do something different in an age that's oversaturated with zombie films, but it was misguided and didn't hit the right notes for me. Of all the Dead films, Survival of the Dead is the hardest for me to review because I never expected this movie to exist. George Romero used to make these movies once every 10 years, and now, in his old age, he cranked out 3 of them in rapid succession. It seems to follow the events of Diary of the Dead, and it has a main recurring character. The 2 things that I didn't like about Diary of the Dead are fixed this time. One is the found footage style, which I thought had potential but was misguided. This time we're back to a regular narrative style. And the other thing is the in-your-face social commentary. This time it's downplayed under the surface, like it should be. And it seems sort of like a recycling of some of the ideas in Day of the Dead and other zombie films, but you really can't blame it because there's been so many zombie movies that pretty much everything's been done already. Overall, Survival of the Dead, it's okay. I don't have any peeves with it like I did with Diary of the Dead, and nothing really sticks out as being groundbreaking either. It's just okay. I think the big problem was that there were so many zombie movies that I was completely numb to the genre. This one just blends in with the rest. If it hadn't been for the name George Romero, I wouldn't have been watching it. But let's not end the Halloween season on such a dull note. Tomorrow, we're going to look at the masterpiece that started it all, Night of the Living Dead. This is one of those instances where I say, the movie's so good, I can't do it justice. Just watch it.